It was supposed to be the happiest day of my son's life, his wedding day. The hall was decorated with white roses, golden ribbons, and crystal chandeliers that sparkled under the lights. 130 guests filled the room. Family, friends, people who had known us for years. Their laughter echoed across the tables, and the music was soft, hopeful, filled with the promise of a new beginning. I sat quietly, proud and nervous, watching my only son step into a new chapter of his life. For a mother, that moment is meant to be precious, a memory to carry for the rest of her days. But what happened that afternoon will stay with me for reasons I never could have imagined. In the middle of the joy and celebration, everything shifted. Words were spoken that cut deeper than knives. A demand was made not out of love, but out of greed. And in front of every single guest, I was not just disrespected, I was humiliated. I could have shouted, I could have fought back. Instead, I chose silence. I chose dignity. And in that silence, I found a power no one expected. Because while they believed they had broken me, I was already taking the first step toward a revenge they would never forget. This is the story of how a wedding turned into a battlefield, and how a single decision, a single phone call, changed everything. I remember waking up that morning with a heart so full, I could hardly breathe. My son's wedding day. For years, I had imagined it. The music, the colors, the smiling faces, the vows that would bind him to the woman he had chosen. I had pressed his suit with my own hands, checked my dress twice, and even polished the shoes I had owned for years just to feel neat, proper, and worthy of the occasion. As I made my way to the hall, I told myself this was the day I would let go a little. A mother's heart is never ready to give her child away, but I wanted to smile through my tears. I wanted to be remembered as a proud mother, glowing in the corner of every photograph. The hall was dazzling. White roses spilled from every centerpiece, golden ribbons curled around the chairs, and crystal chandeliers hung above us, reflecting light like stars trapped in glass. There were 130 guests, family, friends, people who had watched my son grow from a small boy into the man now standing at the altar. I felt the music vibrate under my skin, soft and joyful like the promise of a bright beginning. People greeted me warmly. Some hugged me, some complimented my dress, and many told me how handsome my son looked. And he did. My boy was radiant, his eyes shining with hope. I sat at my assigned table, close enough to see his face clearly, close enough to feel that I was still part of his world. My heart swelled with pride, even as it ached with the knowledge that from this day forward, I would share him with someone else. But pride quickly turned to something else. It happened so suddenly, so violently, that I will never forget the exact moment the world around me seemed to stop. My daughter-in-law, the bride, dressed in white silk with a veil that caught the light like a halo, approached my table. She didn't smile. She didn't lean in gently like a daughter would. She looked at me with eyes sharp as glass, and in a voice loud enough for every single guest to hear, she said, "Give me the keys to your apartment." For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. My smile faltered, but I tried to keep my composure. Surely she didn't mean now, not here, not in front of everyone. But the way she stood, chin high, hand extended, told me she meant every word. The room fell silent. Music, laughter, and clinking glasses faded into an air so thick with tension I could hardly breathe. I managed to whisper, "Now? Why would you ask me for that?" "Here." Her eyes narrowed. She wanted a show, and I realized too late that I was the unwilling star of her cruel little performance. "Because you don't need it anymore," she said. "We'll be moving in after the honeymoon. Hand over the keys right now." Her words hit me harder than a stone. That apartment, my home, was the place where I raised my son. The place where I had cried myself to sleep after losing my husband. The place where every corner held memories too sacred to be bargained away like spare change. And here she was, demanding it as though it were nothing more than a gift bag at a party. I felt 260 eyes staring at me, every guest, every family member frozen, waiting to see what I would do. My hands trembled in my lap. My lips felt dry, but I forced myself to speak. "No," I said softly. "That is my home. I will not give you the keys." Gasps echoed through the hall. Some covered their mouths, some leaned in closer, but not one person stood to defend me. Not even my son. I looked at him, desperate for some sign of support, some flicker of loyalty in his eyes. But he turned his face away, his jaw tight, his hands clasped as though pretending none of this was happening. My heart cracked in that instant. To see my own child, the boy I raised, stand silent as I was humiliated. It was a wound I will carry forever. The bride's face twisted with anger. And then, before I could even take another breath, she raised her hand and slapped me. The sound was sharp, echoing across the hall, louder than the music, louder than my racing heartbeat. My cheek burned, my ears rang, and for a second I thought I might collapse right there. 130 guests watched it happen. Some gasped, some whispered, some averted their eyes as though shame could not touch them if they pretended not to see. And yet not a single hand reached out to help me. Not a single voice spoke in my defense. I looked once more at my son. His face was pale, his eyes downcast, and in that silence, I realized something I never wanted to admit. In that moment, I was utterly alone. But I did not scream. I did not curse. I did not give her the satisfaction of breaking me. I straightened my back, even as my face throbbed. I pressed my hands against the table to keep them from shaking. And I stared at her, not with anger, but with the quiet strength of a woman who has endured far worse than a slap. "Then you will have nothing," I whispered, though I doubt anyone but her heard me. She smirked, believing she had won. The guests shifted uncomfortably, murmurs rippling through the crowd. Some judged me for refusing, some pitied me, and some pretended it had never happened at all. The music resumed awkwardly, but the joy had drained from the hall. The laughter no longer rang true. People stole glances at me, at the bride, at my son, as though waiting for another scene. I sat there, cheeks burning, tears pressing against my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Inside my heart was screaming, breaking apart piece by piece. But on the outside, I remained still, because I knew, even in that moment of humiliation, that the story was not over. Not yet. I didn't scream. I didn't fight back. After the slap, the hall returned to life in the most unnatural way. The music played again, though the notes sounded hollow. Guests tried to laugh, but their voices cracked with unease. Forks tapped against plates. Glasses clinked. Conversations resumed in broken pieces. But the truth was clear. Every single person in that room had seen what happened. They could pretend it didn't, but the echo of that slap lived in the silence between their words. I sat for a few more moments, my hands pressed against my knees to stop the trembling. My cheek still burned. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might break through my chest. I could feel eyes on me, pity from some, judgment from others. But what cut the deepest was the way my son avoided my gaze. Not once did he look at me. Not once did he step forward. That silence from him hurt more than the sting on my face. And so I rose. Slowly, deliberately, with as much dignity as I could gather. My chair scraped softly against the polished floor, but even that sound seemed louder than the laughter around me. My back was straight, my steps measured. I would not run. I would not show them tears. They had taken my pride, but I would not let them see me shatter. I walked past the tables, past the rows of faces frozen in curiosity, some whispering behind cupped hands. The chandeliers sparkled above me like cruel stars, watching silently. The scent of roses and champagne clung to the air, sweet and suffocating all at once. Each step toward the door felt like stepping away from a life I no longer recognized. When I reached the exit, I paused just long enough to draw a breath. The doors loomed tall and heavy, and when I pushed them open, the muffled noise of celebration spilled out behind me, but I did not turn back. Outside, the evening air struck my skin like a balm. Cool, crisp, and honest. The sky had deepened into twilight, streaked with purple and gold, as though the heavens themselves mourned and burned at the same time. I walked a few steps down the path, away from the glow of the hall, until I found a quiet corner beneath a tall oak tree. There, in the shadows, I finally allowed myself a single tear. Just one. It slid down my cheek, carrying with it the weight of every humiliation, every disappointment, every silence I had swallowed. I wiped it quickly. No more tears, I told myself. Not tonight. Tonight there was something else to do. I steadied my breathing. Inhale, exhale. My hands shook as I reached into my bag, pulling out my phone. For a moment, I stared at the screen, my reflection staring back at me, eyes tired, face flushed, but spirit unbroken. My thumb hovered over one number, one I had kept safe for a moment I hoped I'd never need. But tonight, I needed it. I pressed the call. The phone rang only once before a deep, steady voice answered. Hello. Hearing his voice nearly broke me, but I steadied myself. My tone was calm, controlled, each word deliberate. It's me, I said. I need you. There was silence on the other end, but not the kind that hurt. This silence was thick with understanding, the silence of someone who already knew more than I had spoken. Where are you? He asked. At the hall, I whispered. It happened, just like we feared. Another pause, a breath, and then he said, I'll be there soon. I closed my eyes, relief washing over me. For the first time that day, I felt less alone. This man, he was not just anyone. He was the one person who carried truths buried deep beneath the surface of our family. Truths no one dared to speak out loud. Truths my son either ignored or had chosen to forget. He knew the secrets my daughter-in-law prayed would stay hidden. He held the power to unravel the carefully woven lies that had poisoned what should have been a day of love. And he carried with him something else, something more powerful than revenge itself. Proof. As I stood there, leaning against the rough bark of the tree, I thought back to the first time I met him. He had been a friend to my late husband, a man who had seen our family in ways outsiders never could. Over the years, he became more than that. A protector, a witness, a keeper of knowledge no one else dared to hold. He had promised me once, if the day comes when you cannot stand alone, call me. I'll bring the truth. And so I did. The minutes stretched long after the call ended. The night air grew colder, but my resolve grew warmer. I could still hear faint laughter and music spilling from the hall. People were dancing, eating, pretending nothing had happened. But they didn't know what was coming. They didn't know that the silence I had chosen was not surrender. It was strategy. For the first time since the slap, my hands stopped trembling. I stood taller beneath that oak, the weight of humiliation slowly giving way to the fire of determination. They thought I had left broken. They thought I had walked away defeated. But in truth, I had walked out to summon the one man who could change everything. And in less than half an hour, he would walk through those same doors I had exited. And when they saw him, when they heard what he had to say, their world, not mine, would collapse. I straightened my dress, pressed my palms against my cheeks to hide the redness, and drew one final breath. I would go back inside soon, but I would not go back alone, because sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is the moment right before the storm, and the storm was already on its way. 30 minutes. That's how long I waited outside, under the old oak tree, the sound of laughter and music muffled by the thick doors of the hall. 30 minutes in which I replayed the slap over and over in my mind, each echo reminding me of the humiliation I had endured in front of 130 guests. 30 minutes of silence, of breathing, of holding myself together while the world inside pretended that nothing had happened. And then, it was time. The heavy doors at the far end of the hall creaked open. At first, nobody noticed. The music was still playing, the guests were still eating, drinking, whispering. But when the man stepped inside, the air shifted. A ripple passed through the room, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to mouths. The chandeliers above seemed to tremble with the sudden hush that fell across the hall. The man had arrived. He was tall, his shoulders broad, his hair silvered with age but not weakness. His steps were measured, steady, the kind of walk that belonged to a man who carried authority without needing to raise his voice. He didn't belong to their world of glitter and pretense. His presence was weightier, sharper, undeniable. I watched from near the doorway as he made his way inside. Every eye followed him, yet he didn't glance at anyone. He carried himself with a purpose, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He wasn't dressed in finery like the other guests. No silk tie, no polished shoes. Just a dark suit, worn but dignified, that made him stand out even more. And it was that very contrast that shook the room. Whispers started almost immediately, soft but urgent. "Who is that?" "What's he doing here?" "Do you know him?" The bride noticed him first. Her smile faltered, the glass in her hand slipping slightly, as though her strength had drained in an instant. Her veil shimmered under the lights, but her face paled beneath it, her eyes widening with something she couldn't disguise. Fear. My son turned next. He stiffened, his mouth parting as though to speak, but no words came. His hands, which had been so steady on his wine glass, began to tremble. He knew this man? Oh yes, he knew him. And slowly, the rest of the family began to recognize him too. I saw it in their faces. The dawning horror, the panic trying to hide behind polite smiles. They shifted in their chairs, straightened their backs. Some even reached for their drinks as though a sip of champagne could wash away the dread that had suddenly gripped their hearts. But it couldn't, because they knew, as I knew, that his arrival meant only one thing. The truth had finally walked through the door. The music faltered. The band tried to keep playing, but the notes stumbled, uneven, as if the instruments themselves could feel the tension. The chatter died completely, replaced by the hush of 130 guests who had no idea what storm was about to break. The man stopped at the center of the hall. His presence filled the space like thunderclouds gathering overhead. He didn't need to raise his voice. His silence alone demanded attention. Every whisper faded, every movement stilled, until the room held its breath. I could see the bride clutching her gown with trembling fingers, her lips pressed together so tightly they had turned white. My son stood beside her, his face pale, his body rigid, his eyes darting anywhere but at the man who had just entered. And in that silence, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time since the slap, I no longer felt small, no longer humiliated, no longer alone. The man's presence was like a shield, and though he hadn't spoken a single word yet, I knew. Justice was about to find its voice. He cleared his throat, a simple sound, but in that quiet hall it rang like a bell. Some guests leaned forward, desperate to catch his words. Others glanced nervously at one another, unsure if they should stay seated or rise. But no one dared interrupt him. The bride whispered something to my son, urgent and frantic, but he shook his head, helpless. His hands tightened into fists at his sides. And then, the man spoke. His voice was steady, deep, calm, but it carried power. It was the kind of voice that didn't ask for respect. It commanded it. "I did not come here to celebrate," he said. "I came here because the truth refuses to stay buried." A ripple went through the crowd. Some gasped. Others looked at each other in confusion. The bride's knees buckled slightly. She reached for my son's arm to steady herself. He continued, "You sit here dressed in silk and gold, toasting to love and happiness. But beneath the glitter lies deceit. And tonight, that deceit ends." The guests shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between the bride and the groom. The bride's family squirmed in their seats, their faces pale and drawn. My son's jaw tightened. He finally raised his eyes to the man, his expression a mixture of defiance and dread. "What are you doing here?" my son muttered, though his voice shook. The man didn't answer him directly. Instead, he turned to the crowd. "I was a friend to the groom's father," he said, his eyes sweeping across the room, locking on each face as though daring them to look away. "I was there when promises were made. I was there when truths were hidden, and I am here now to make sure those truths are heard." A gasp escaped from one of the older relatives seated near the front. Others whispered frantically, trying to piece together what he meant. The bride's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks as she shook her head violently. "Stop!" she hissed, her voice trembling. "Don't you dare!" But the man didn't stop. He stepped closer, his presence towering over the bride and groom, his words slicing through the tension like a blade. "You wanted her keys," he said sharply, his gaze locked on the bride. "You humiliated her in front of every single person in this room. You thought no one knew why. But I know. I know the truth you've hidden, the lies you've told, the greed that has poisoned every word from your mouth." The hall erupted in murmurs. Guests turned to each other, eyes wide, voices hushed but frantic. The story was unfolding before them like a storm tearing through calm waters, and no one could look away. The bride sobbed openly now, her shoulders shaking. My son tried to pull her close, to shield her, but the man's voice cut through even his desperate attempt. "Do not protect her," he said firmly, "because when the truth is revealed, you will see that she never protected you." My son froze. His arms fell limp at his sides. The guests stared, caught between disbelief and fascination. And I stood near the doorway, my heart pounding but my spirit rising. For the first time in years, I felt seen. I felt defended. I felt as though every wound, every silence, every humiliation had been leading to this moment. Because the man had walked in, and with him, the truth. The bride's cries filled the hall. My son's silence screamed louder than her sobs. And the guests leaned in, their faces pale, their breaths shallow, waiting, desperate, for the rest of what was to come. The storm had arrived, and there was no turning back. The silence after his words was unbearable. 130 guests held their breath, waiting for what would come next. The chandeliers glittered above us, but their light felt colder now, as though the room itself braced for a storm. The man's voice, calm yet sharp, filled the hall like thunder. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on the bride, and when he spoke again, it was not to me, not to my son, not even to her parents. It was to everyone. "You all sit here celebrating," he began, his tone steady but heavy, "yet you don't know the truth of who you've come to honor. This woman," his finger pointed toward the trembling bride, "is not the innocent daughter-in-law she pretends to be. Her family, her promises, and even her love are built on lies." Gasps spread like wildfire through the crowd. Guests leaned forward in their chairs, eyes wide, mouths parted in disbelief. Some whispered frantically to each other while others clutched their pearls, their wine glasses, their partner's arms. The bride shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "Stop! Don't say another word!" she cried, her voice breaking. But the man did not stop. "You humiliated his mother in front of all of you," he said, his voice rising now, strong and unwavering. You slapped her, demanded her home, because you believed it was yours by right. But what none of you know is that her family has been plotting for this moment for years. They wanted her son, not for love, but for what he could give them, for what they could take. A wave of murmurs swept across the hall. Forks clattered onto plates. A woman in the front row gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her hand. Another guest whispered, "Is it true?" The bride's parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces pale, their hands tightening around the tablecloth, as though gripping it could stop the unraveling of everything they had built. The man turned toward them, his eyes narrowing. You thought your secrets would remain hidden. But I was there. I saw the deals, the debts, the forged papers. Your family is drowning in debt, and you sought to use this marriage as your lifeline. You wanted her son's name, his inheritance, his stability. You wanted everything he and his mother worked for, everything his late father built with his own hands. The room erupted. Voices overlapped in disbelief. Debt? Someone shouted. Inheritance? Another whispered. The bride broke into sobs, covering her face with trembling hands. My son, pale and frozen, looked at her with wide, horrified eyes. His lips moved, but no words came out. He trembled, his whole body shaking as though the ground beneath him had been pulled away. The man's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. She told you she loved you, he said, looking at my son now. But ask yourself, how many times did she pressure you about money, about your mother's home, about what she thought she was owed? Does that sound like love, or does it sound like greed? My son staggered back a step, his breath ragged. His glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The bride reached for him, desperate, but he pulled away, his face twisted in disbelief and betrayal. No, he whispered. No, this can't be true. But it was true, and the man was not finished. He turned back to the bride, his voice like thunder now. Your family forged documents to make it seem like you were wealthier than you are. They covered up lawsuits, unpaid debts, lies stacked upon lies. And you played the part of the perfect bride, all while scheming to strip his mother of the one thing she has left, her home. The guests were in chaos now. Some stood, pointing, whispering, arguing. Others sat frozen, unable to process the storm unraveling before them. Every secret was spilling into the open, every mask torn away. The bride's sobs turned to wails. She dropped to her knees, her gown pooling around her like a broken curtain. Her makeup streaked down her face. Her voice cracked as she begged. Please, stop. Please, she cried, rocking back and forth. But the man did not stop. You thought this wedding was your victory, he said, his voice steady. But all you have built is a tower of lies. And now, in front of every guest, every witness, that tower falls. My son's hands covered his face, his shoulders shaking. He looked around as if searching for an escape, for someone to tell him it wasn't true. But the silence of his bride's family, their pale faces and downcast eyes, told him everything he needed to know. The truth was undeniable. One guest shouted, "How could you?" Another murmured, "I knew something wasn't right." The hall was alive with gasps, with whispers, with disbelief so sharp it cut the air like glass. And I stood there, near the doorway, watching it unfold. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking, but this time not from humiliation. This time it was vindication, for every time I had been silenced, for every insult I had endured, for the sting of her slap, for the way they made me feel small. This moment was the answer. This was justice. I lifted my chin, tears brimming in my eyes, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming weight of truth finally breaking free. The bride collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably, her cries echoing against the walls. My son stood broken, trembling, the illusion of his perfect love story shattering before him. The guests, those who had once judged me, pitied me, ignored me, now looked at me with wide eyes, their faces flushed with shame for ever doubting me. The room that had once been filled with laughter and music now pulsed with chaos, betrayal, and revelation. And in that chaos, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Strength. Because the truth was no longer hidden. The lies were no longer winning, and I was no longer alone. The room was already crumbling under the weight of the truth when I finally stepped forward. For so long, I had been silent. The quiet mother, the grieving widow, the woman they thought was easy to dismiss, easy to humiliate, easy to strip of everything she had left. But in that moment, I felt no anger. Only clarity, only strength. All eyes turned to me as I moved toward the center of the hall. My footsteps echoed on the polished floor, steady and deliberate, as though I had been waiting for this walk my entire life. I stopped near the head table where the bride still knelt, her sobs breaking the room into pieces. My son stood behind her, pale and trembling, his hands clenched at his sides. The man, the one I had called, the one who had pulled back the curtain on all their lies, stepped aside. His role was nearly finished. Mine was only beginning. I took a deep breath, my voice calm, unwavering, carrying through the hall without the need for anger. "You wanted my apartment," I began, my eyes fixed on the bride. "You wanted my home, the place where I raised my son, the last piece of my husband that I still hold. You thought you could demand it, take it from me with threats and humiliation. But what you didn't know is that apartment was never just mine to give, and it was never yours to take." The hall fell into absolute silence. The chandeliers above seemed frozen, their light caught in 1,000 crystals, waiting for my next words. I turned slowly, my gaze moving from guest to guest, letting the weight of my words linger. Then, finally, I looked at my son. His eyes were red, filled with confusion, grief, and something deeper, a desperate need to understand. "I had prepared for this moment," I said softly, "long before today, because I knew the type of woman you were marrying. I knew the whispers, the lies, the greed that drove this union, and I refused to walk into this day unprotected." The bride lifted her head, her face streaked with tears, her voice shaking. "You're lying. You're just trying to ruin me." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "You want my apartment keys?" I said, pulling them slowly from my purse. The small metal glimmered in the light as I held them high for all to see. Gasps echoed across the hall. "These are the keys you demanded in front of 130 witnesses. The keys you believed would open the door to your new empire. But these keys don't unlock what you think they do." I let the silence stretch. The bride's sobs turned into shallow, panicked breaths. "Months ago," I continued, "I transferred ownership of my apartment into a trust. That trust belongs to me and me alone, and no one can touch it. Not my son, not his wife, not her family. It cannot be sold, seized, or stolen. These keys are worthless to you. The papers are sealed. The property is mine, forever." A stunned murmur ran through the guests. Someone clapped their hand over their mouth. Another whispered, "She planned all of this." The bride's face crumpled. She shook her head violently. "No, that's not possible, but you can't do that." "Oh, but I did," I replied, my tone steady, almost gentle. "Because I've lived long enough to know what greed looks like, and I wasn't about to let greed destroy my family. You thought you were clever, demanding what wasn't yours. But the truth is, you were never even close to holding it." Her parents shifted in their seats, their faces growing red, their hands twitching nervously. They had nothing left to say. But I wasn't finished. "You see," I went on, my voice firm. The apartment is only part of the story. What you never knew, what none of you in this room knew, not even my son, is that when my husband passed, he left behind more than memories. He left behind a fortune, properties, investments, inheritance that I kept quiet about, because wealth is dangerous in the wrong hands. I wanted my son to grow into his own man, not into someone who lived entitled, waiting for money to fall into his lap. Gasps filled the air again. My son looked at me, stunned, his lips trembling as he tried to process my words. The bride let out a wail so sharp it cut through the room. "You mean," my son whispered, his voice barely audible, "all this time?" I nodded, my eyes meeting his. "Yes. All this time I have carried the weight of that inheritance, quietly, safely. And now, standing here, I thank God that I did. Because if I hadn't, she would have taken everything, every dollar, every brick, every memory of your father's sacrifice." The bride screamed then, a raw, desperate cry. "You're lying! You're making this up! He told me you had nothing, that you lived modestly, that was the point," I interrupted, my voice sharp for the first time. "We lived modestly because we valued dignity over greed. We valued family over fortune, something your family could never understand." The guests nodded, whispers turning to agreement, to sympathy, to something like admiration. People who had once ignored me, who had once dismissed me as weak, now looked at me with respect in their eyes. The bride's tears fell harder. She clutched at her gown, clawing at her chest, as if the truth itself was suffocating her. Her parents sat frozen, their faces drained of color. The man who had revealed their lies stood silently at the edge of the room, his job complete, his eyes steady on me. I took one final step forward, my voice strong and clear, each word deliberate. "You slapped me in front of 130 people. You thought you were humiliating me, but what you really did was expose yourself. And now every person in this room knows who you are, and what you and your family truly wanted." The bride collapsed again, her cries echoing in the hollow silence. My son stood stiff, his chest heaving, his eyes wet with tears. He looked at me, then at her, and for the first time, I saw it. The clarity in his eyes. The truth had broken through. I held the keys in my hand one last time before slipping them back into my purse. "These are mine," I said softly, "and they will remain mine. My home, my inheritance, my dignity, they are not for sale, not for anyone. And certainly not for you." The guests erupted in applause. Some clapped slowly, others rose to their feet. Their faces were lit with awe, with respect, with vindication for me, the woman they had doubted, the woman they had seen humiliated, the woman they now saw standing tall. I did not bow. I did not smile with arrogance. I simply stood, my heart steady, my voice calm, because this was not a victory born of vengeance. It was justice. It was truth. The bride wept into her hands. Her parents sat in silence, and my son finally walked toward me. His steps were hesitant, his eyes filled with pain and shame, but he came. And when he reached me, he whispered through trembling lips, "I'm sorry, Mom." I placed a hand on his shoulder, my voice gentle. "Don't be sorry, my son. Be wiser. Learn from this. Because the people who love you will never ask you to betray the ones who raised you." The hall was still buzzing, the air charged with the weight of revelation. But within me, there was peace, for I had not needed anger or shouting or revenge fueled by rage. My revenge had been quiet, patient, prepared long before this day. And in the end, the truth was my greatest weapon. The day that began as my son's wedding ended as a reckoning. Not for me, not for him, but for the woman who thought she could steal everything and the family who stood behind her. And as I stood there, strong and unbroken, I knew this. Humiliation fades, lies crumble, but dignity endures forever. They thought they could humiliate me. They believed that by raising their voices, by slapping me in front of everyone, by demanding what was never theirs, they could strip me of my dignity. But in the end, it was their own actions that destroyed them. I did not need to fight with anger. I did not need to scream or lower myself to their level. I held my silence. I held my strength. And I waited. Because patience has its own power, a power far greater than revenge alone. This day taught me something I will never forget. Family is not built on greed or money or possession. Family is built on love, on respect, on loyalty that cannot be bought or sold. And when someone forgets that, when they place greed above blood and gold above trust, their foundation crumbles. Always. As I left that hall, I knew one thing with certainty. I had not just defended my home or my inheritance. I had defended my dignity. And dignity, once protected, can never be stolen. Because the truth is simple. Respect is wealth. Greed is poverty, and dignity endures forever.